This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us on this Friday's program, we start with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. He joins us for this week's grain market update, where he shares that prices are continuing to rise, if not remain steady, and celebrates the optimism that this week's precipitation across the state has brought. Also ahead, Jason Warner, K-State cow-calf specialist, shares insight on culling smarter, not harder during these difficult times. He emphasizes the importance of keeping records and the value of those records when making culling decisions. We conclude with this week's agricultural weather report with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip shares news of the precipitation received in all counties across Kansas the last several days and the chance for a break in La Niña weather patterns come the new year. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. Is Agriculture Today. We are back now for our weekly grain market update, and joining us to cover it, as always, is Dan O'Brien. He is our K-State grain market economist. So, Dan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Samantha.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and start off with some of our futures trends that we've seen in the past week. I understand there's been kind of a continuation of a lot of these prices.
Yes, we've seen wheat of late in the last several days continue to move to the higher side. We were trading down around $9 3 or 4 days ago and closed yesterday at $9.79.5, got a little bit higher than that on the trade, heading seemingly back to $10. So that's probably the most definite upward trend that we see amongst the major grains that we're watching, and that'd be, again, the hard red winter wheat contract out of CME for the lead Dees contract. When you look at corn, though, corn futures had gotten up to a high of about, $7 in the last couple weeks and have been moving around sort of in kind of a quasi-sideways move since that time. I think no doubt that followed from that USDA report that came in with a projection below 14 billion bushels. So we have recovered a lot of the loss that we'd had from the highs of about 765, 770 just about back in April, May, and that had fallen down in mid-July down to about 560. Well, now we're back knocking on the door of $7. To me, it makes a person wonder about when we come to the next WASDE report, October the 12th, to what degree will we be moving around after that? Of course, before that time, we're going to get some harvest reports in, so we'll have some actual data from the field that will impact things. And for soybeans pretty similar to corn, but maybe a little bit more volatile, had been up within the last 2 weeks to about $15.10, 15 to 15, had fallen back down to 14, probably 14.30 thereabouts, and traded yesterday at 14.57. So a lot of volatility. I'm seasoned enough when I can remember 5 or 10 cents causing excitement in the market, and this is just now noise, given all this stuff. So in terms of the national markets, it does seem that the wheat markets move to the higher side, and really part of that has to do probably with some strength we've seen in U.S. wheat exports. We've had 2 consecutive weeks of just under 25 million bushels of wheat actually being exported, and we need a pace of about 17 to meet the USDA's projections. So that's really all for the good. And, we look for signs of that in Kansas by looking for wheat basis trends. And we do have in our written notes this week a follow-up of that. So we see in Northwest Kansas probably a fair trend to the higher side, and other general trends moving sideways to positive. So I think if the wheat futures are moving up and the basis levels are holding steady, then we're seeing cash prices on the local level still pretty strong. Again, we're looking at cash markets for wheat in the major areas that we're looking at, again, and taking the top bids. There are some lower than this, but in the elevators we're watching, $9.35 on the low side up to $9.64 on the high, and the 9.64s both are coming in, they're coming in major export markets in Salina and Hutchinson, and with Topeka just about a dime behind that. So it seems that we're getting some export movement, then that's giving us some pretty decent basis trends and basis support in some of these areas. And we've had our attention so much on the corn market and soybean market of late, and to some degree on the grain sorghum. That's interesting and kind of refreshing to see the strength that's being exhibited now in the wheat.
Absolutely, yeah. The strength in exports that we're seeing, where is that mostly coming from?
Well, I need to dig into the specifics of which countries are doing, but a lot of times we're looking at Mexico as a primary buyer, and a lot of countries in our hemisphere that are coming into play, the Caribbean, and that makes sense given the higher cost of transportation to go, again, across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, elsewhere. So a lot of our strength comes from our neck of the woods, and we're probably not economically set to go head-to-head with Russia or the European Union, even though they're a little short this year, to sell to countries in the Middle East just because of these transportation differentials. One last thing, I'm all excited on wheat, but that we're seeing this in spite of the high U.S. dollar. And normally the high U.S. dollar works against wheat the most because there's so many competitors in those markets. But still, we're seeing what's occurring in the wheat market, and it's kind of a surprise, at least to this analyst.
Absolutely, yeah, something that we'll continue to follow for sure. And I understand that when it comes to what we're seeing currently, there's a lot to be said in terms of supply and demand, and obviously you guys track that on agmanager.info, and that's in the form of kind of the balance sheets that you guys put together. So let's talk through some of those.
Probably the best numbers I have of value to bring on the supply-demand side would be in corn and on soybeans. For corn, there's still a major question on where the USDA's final yield per acre and production numbers will come in. So we put together a number of scenarios on our info, looking at what happens at the current level, the 172.5 bushels per acre and 13.944 billion bushels, but also plugging in on the same acres, reduced acres from what had been expected, a yield of 171 bushel an acre, 169.5, 168. 168 matched that early Midwest Farm Tour number, so it's out there as something to consider. And you keep narrowing U.S. production down to 13.8 billion bushels to 13.7 to 13.6, but probably most importantly, you eventually get to the place where you take ending stocks for this marketing year that we're in now, way out there on August 31st, they get eventually below 1 billion bushels. Stocks to use gets below 7 down to 6, and prices from being projected at 6.75 now by the USDA for this marketing year end up above $7, and in the most extreme cases, above 8 and beyond. So, we've got tight supply demand in the U.S. Our basis levels for corn show that. When you look at the strength in basis, that's holding up virtually everywhere across the state, except it's strongest in the western two-thirds, still holding decent in the eastern third, but all at record high levels from at least since 2000, the highest we've seen by far since at least 2008. We're even seeing now on grain sorghum, which we generally thinking of more of an export side. You're seeing in the western third of the state where we're converting a lot of that into feedlot usage, or feeding usage or ethanol usage. You're seeing strength in basis in the Colby area, in the Garden City area, in the Salina area. Also some movements pretty decently. That's an ag term for trying to analyze markets that you don't have good numbers on. Anyway, but the point is that we're seeing good basis movement even for grain sorghum. And to me, that's an indicator probably, at least I suspect, that we're looking at grain sorghum in areas of tight supply being all that much more used for feed, and maybe even some ethanol plants.
Absolutely, yeah, an option that producers are considering more and more with how tight things are getting for sure. And then I know everybody is probably celebrating this as much as we are, but we've had some recent rains across the state. We were chatting beforehand, and last I checked our Kansas Mesonet website, we had rain across every single county in our state, which is absolutely incredible.
For someone, for a climatologist that looks at that whole soil profile, that may or may not be as exciting of a thing. But at least if we have rain in the topsoil, there's hope that maybe more will follow. We'll see. And if they have moisture, they can put wheat in and get it germinated. And then hopefully if they get snow cover, live to fight another day out in the spring. I'm talking about an area that really Romulo Lulato should be talking about a lot more so than me. But as you and I were talking last week, we were kind of really I was really hand-wringing over how dry things were and how that would set us up for planting wheat or not. Well, now we've had some moisture. Perhaps it'll help on the trend, and at least in the top few inches, we have a better chance of seeding wheat and getting germination, and then we'll go on from there.
Absolutely, yes. Less use of the term dusting wheat and more planting. That's what I'm looking forward to hearing more of.
Yes. I would add in just quickly on also have some numbers on soybean production and some projections. And USDA's current projection is for about $14.35 for a season average price and about 4.3 billion bushels. And there's risk. We could go either direction from that. I guess I'm still thinking that a high U.S. dollar and a pretty successful run of exports out of South America is probably working. We may whittle down our export number a little bit more, but and if that happens at the same production, then we'd see some weakness in price. Still great prices, more like $13.35 instead of $14.35. But if you have that same whittling down of exports, but then end up and drop U.S. soybean production another bushel down to 49.5, very, very possible. Then you're then instead of $14.35, at least by my numbers, you're $1.50 or $2 higher. So you've got quite the situation to consider in the soybean market, and a lot will be riding on the October 12th report to give us some direction on that.
Absolutely, yeah. Something we'll look forward to hearing more from and learning more from for sure. And as those numbers get secured, we'll know more and more what we're really working with. But still more to come on that, obviously. But Dan, as always, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Samantha. Take care.
Absolutely, you as well. Once again, that was Dan O'Brien. He is our K-State grain market economist covering this week's grain market update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with Jason Warner. He is our K-State cow-calf specialist, and today we're going to be covering the theme of maybe culling smarter, not harder, for those of you that are going through the process of culling in your own operations currently. But first and foremost, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Samantha. Good to be here. Thanks for the invite and the opportunity to be with you again.
Absolutely. You've got a lot going on within the industry. What does the climate really look like?
We're at a time of the year where we typically see a lot of general culling out of cow herds. This year, of course, has been a much different year with the dry conditions that we've seen. And so as we look at it in the big picture, we've seen a pretty high rate of culling out of our cow herds. That's really been a function of what we've seen not only earlier on this spring, but throughout the summer and into the fall months as well.
Not only just a lot of movement going on, but we're expecting even more potentially with some of the high hay prices we're really expecting to see.
When you go back and you look not only at the dry conditions that we've seen from a forage standpoint, but when we look at just hay prices, looked at some data that would suggest that overall what we're expecting, and this is according to the USDA, overall across the United States, our average price for hay, and this wouldn't be necessarily particular for any one type of hay, but just an overall average, is expected to be throughout the end of this year approximately $25 to $30 per ton higher. And so we're certainly seeing, of course, some high forage prices that's influencing what we're seeing to some extent when we look at cow slaughter and culling rates and those types of things.
Absolutely, yeah. And in terms of that direct relationship, how we're seeing it play out, our current cow inventory, we're seeing the effects of that in that right now, correct?
That's right. It's interesting when you go back and look at it, what our slaughter rates have been. If you look at it since the beginning of the year, we've seen overall generally elevated cow slaughter rates, and specifically beef cow slaughter rates. And since the beginning of the year, we're running at about a little over 13% increase above where we were last year in 2021. And we were already running at a pretty high level there in 2021. And so now, especially where we're getting into the fall of the year and the typical season where we see more females that are being culled out of these herds and come to town, and we see slaughter rates typically increase, it's definitely pointing towards a much lower inventory as we work towards the end of the year. And there's some indications there that we would be somewhere from a cow inventory standpoint down to the levels that we saw during the years 2012 to maybe 2016, which is really the last drought cycle that we went through. And so definitely seeing some very high culling rates on average across the country. And of course, they're going to be magnified in different areas depending depending on the region and what specific conditions are in certain areas. But we're definitely seeing very, very high prices there. And, of course, that always begs the question, what will replacement female prices be on the backside of it, especially as we get into the first of the year?
Those cow prices really are key in what we're talking about in this conversation today. A lot of people, they're thinking, well, now's the best time to sell in terms of maybe future outlooks, but what are some of our future cow prices that we see going forward?
When you look at it for right now, there's clearly a big incentive for producers if they're short on forage, short on feed, and obviously we're looking at the outlook from a moisture standpoint and a price situation. When we look at where the cull cow market is, there's a great incentive to sell some of these females out of the herd, and there is some information, some data that would suggest that on average, as we work towards the fourth quarter of this year, we're expecting on average U.S. cull cow prices to be somewhere around $75 a hundredweight. And if that holds true as we get into the fourth quarter of this year, we would see that we would be around $10 per hundredweight higher than what we experienced on average last year. And when we look at the cull cow market locally, there's reports from here in Kansas that we're seeing slaughter cow prices anywhere from the mid-70s on up to the low to mid-80s. So there's a real incentive for producers from just a financial standpoint. If we're short on forage and we're looking at high feed prices, that's a good value to get back on a cull female. But again, we've got to be thinking about what the price of those females is going to be. And the thing that we always have to keep in mind is that when we look at whether or not it makes sense to add some weight to these females and sell them, it comes back to what's the value of the gain relative to the cost of gain that we're going to have.
I know you have some of those numbers broken down for us here. So cost of gain, is it worth it at this current moment, or is it kind of like, maybe?
It looks that there would maybe be about a value of a gain right now on some of these cows. Again, depending on weight and condition, it would be right around $1.15 a pound. So the idea would be is that if we can feed those females and add that weight onto them for a cost that is equal to that or something less than that, then there would be value to do that. And when we look at it with the high feed prices that we have right now, it's going to be challenging, I think, to make a cost of gain that's a whole lot lower than that unless we have access to some really cheap and low-price feedstuffs. And so it's really going to be a situation where each producer has to work through the economics of that. And there are times in the past especially where that can work really well. If you can advance those females in weight and price, that can be a really nice financial return there. This year is just going to be a much different situation because we're already working with a very elevated cull cow market price, and feed prices, of course, are high, and so that really changes the picture there for everyone.
Even just comparing the differences between your herds, so either your spring calving herd or your fall calving herd, there's some differences there to keep in mind as well, right?
There really are, and really that just comes back to timing and when we're going to have those females available. And the thing I would say is for spring calving cow herds, we're at the time of the year now, and especially where we've had such dry conditions, we've probably already seen a lot of situations or had some situations where producers have decided to make those management decisions on those females and market those females earlier than what they normally would. And if they haven't, maybe your forage situation is a little bit better or more optimal. You've still got some time, but now is a good time to be making those decisions on which females you're going to retain back and which females you're going to let go of. Really, at the end of the day, what we want to try to do is retain those highest quality, best, most desirable females back within our herd, and so we really have to make sure that we're making very informed management decisions on that. With fall calving cow herds, they're a little bit different from the standpoint of when we would think about when we would typically make those culling decisions on those females, typically at weaning time, which for most fall calving herds is in the spring. You can make a decision to move that female and liquidate that female from your cow herd at a time where typically we see a seasonal increase in cull cow prices going into the spring as we see an increase in seasonal pattern for beef demand. This year, again, though, where we're going to be working with what we would expect to be very tight and higher prices for forages, we may want to be thinking about making those decisions now. And so if we have an opportunity to identify some females when we're getting ready to start calving, that might be a good time for us to be thinking about that.
You mentioned wanting to keep our most productive, highest quality females. How can producers really do that? What are the strategies they can keep in mind?
The most important thing that I think that we really need to emphasize with producers is being able to go back and look at calving records. If you're not going to record any other data or any other information on your cow herd at any other time throughout the year, at calving is the most important thing because that really tells us a lot. It sounds simple, but it's very easy for folks to make note of things, but then forget about that information or forget about those notes that they had on particular females as they go throughout the year. It's easier said than done, so if you're only going to do it once out of the year, at calving is the best time.
Absolutely. And in terms of some of these notes that we're keeping up with, maybe some of the reasons why we might cull cows in the future, some things to track, what are some of those?
The biggest things that we think about are females that are non-pregnant, and those are usually the females that are usually our younger females are coming 3s or 4s, and then our older cows would represent the biggest proportion of that. The basics, the females that have poor dispositions, poor mothering ability, if we've had any issues with prolapses, poor teat and udder conformation, of course soundness issues, those are the big things that we're obviously going to want to be able to go back and reference. I really think it's important to take a look at, again, going back to your calving records, identifying those females that calve after the 63rd day of the start of the calving season, or in other words, getting you into that third estrus cycle, because those females, of course, are not only going to wean lighter calves, but there's a greater opportunity that we're going to run into those females that are non-conceiving or that are open following the subsequent breeding season if they're later calving, and there's a lot of value for those females calving at the beginning of our calving season. And the other part of it, too, is if we're recording individual weaning weights on calves, being able to look at ratios and be able to have a good comparison to what the average weaning weight would be on a group of calves to identify where that calf is relative to its contemporaries. So those are all good things that we want to be able to keep in mind and make sure that we're looking at so we can make informed decisions when we think about moving these females and deciding which ones we need to keep back within our core group and which ones we need to let go of.
Definitely a reminder of the importance of keeping detailed records when possible. But I know you also, coming in today, you wanted to highlight some upcoming programs that are going on here at K-State and across the state. So what are some of those?
I just wanted to mention that our research and extension group here at K-State is going to be hosting a number of meetings. And the first one will be held September 26th in Cherryvale. And the idea behind these meetings is to give folks some good background information to be able to make some educated decisions on managing our cow herds through these challenging times from a forage and forage planning perspective. And so the main topics that we're going to be discussing at these meetings are going to be things like managing our forage inventory, managing some alternative feedstuffs that maybe we don't utilize in a typical year, being able to manage some more challenging feedstuffs that we don't normally work with. Then also, too, thinking about how we're going to manage not only cow herds but also calf crops as well, too, with limited forage supplies, and how we might assess what our needs are going forward and be forward thinking about that. And so the whole goal is to provide some good information out there for folks that we can help make some good decisions on. Information will be presented by our beef extension team. There'll be time for formal discussion, but then also we're going to try to block out a good amount of time for folks to be able to have open discussion about some different topics that are specific to them that they're dealing with. We have 7 meetings currently scheduled. They're going to run through basically the middle of October. And you can find full information and details on those meetings at our research and extension website for K-State, which is ksubeef.org, or you can feel free to contact your local extension office, and those folks there will get full details on those meetings in your area.
That will be linked in the show notes of today's program, as always, which can be found on agtoday.net. But Jason, thank you so much again for your time today.
I appreciate it, Samantha. Thanks for the opportunity. Good to visit.
Once again, that was Jason Warner. He is our K-State cow-calf specialist. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now for our weekly agricultural weather reports, which is, as always, brought to us by Chip Redmond, our K-State meteorologist. So, Chip, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. It rained.
It rained. Yay. Yeah, I feel like as we're talking about all of this, that's just all I can think about is yay rain.
Yeah, yay rain, especially after the weekend we had. It was just incredibly warm. We set a lot of records across the state, even as late as Monday and Tuesday. And looking back at the numbers, we're on the back end of like the latest 100-degree days that we normally see. In fact, a lot of the records that were broken over the last several days were at right around that 100 to 101 threshold. And so we didn't set the latest in several locations, especially in the southwest part of the state. And we didn't do it for Manhattan either. Our actual latest is the 28th of September, which is crazy late, but it was an anomaly. So if we ever see hundreds again, we're going to be setting records across the state. But the wind was just, it was mean. We haven't had wind for a while. We saw wind gusts 30 to 35. We had some large fires as a result, and we also saw really low humidity. A lot of vegetation got really stressed over the last 3 or 4 days. More stressed, I think, than what they did even in July. But thankfully, that's all in the rearview mirror, and we got some much-needed moisture. Some areas got inch to inch and a half, and even isolated areas of 2 inches there in north-central into northwest Kansas. But everyone recorded some moisture, which is great. However, both the southwest and the southeast kind of missed the ball again, where maybe a few hundredths to a tenth of an inch for the lucky folks, but we really needed this moisture, and not just a quick one and dump. It was a nice, dragged-out, light to occasionally moderate rain event that got really soaked in the soil.
But in terms of what we can see going ahead, I know you just mentioned maybe that was our last 100-degree day for the calendar year?
Yeah, let's hope that. The drought monitor that came out today had the first introduction of D4 drought in the southeast and south central, actually a very large area. And so that's a reminder to us that, yeah, this rain was really beneficial, but we're in a long-term drought. So the forecast looking out in the future doesn't bring much change. This is kind of a bump in the road towards the positive side. Great for the wheat folks who hopefully don't have to dust in wheat now, have some moisture to get it up. But warmer than normal conditions are expected for the next week to 2 weeks, possibly 3 weeks. We're not talking 100-degree heat, but we're talking just our average low temperatures this time of year for much of the state, except for the southeast, are getting into the 40s by late September, and we're not going to see that. We're going to be well above that. We'll have lows in the upper 50s with highs in the 80s to even occasionally 90 degrees possible. And then the precipitation side, it's kind of a summer-like pattern with that warmth. And with precipitation, we just don't see much. In fact, this last system kind of shut off all of western and central United States of moisture. And so very dry conditions expected into October.
Beyond that, though, I'm hearing there's some changes in what we're thinking might be going on.
Yeah, and we're expecting these kind of conditions really through the end of the year. There's really no light at the end of the tunnel. We're in the La Niña year. Confidence is increasing that La Niña is going to try to break as we get into the new year gradually. It's not going to be a flip the switch kind of thing. And then we're also looking at perhaps an active northern jet stream, or what we call polar vortex or negative North American oscillation. That would mean more active weather than we've seen the last few winters, where we could have some potential additional cold snaps, not like widespread cold, but that would hopefully bring some additional moisture. It is our driest time of the year, and the driver of that is we're looking at the southern hemisphere. They had a big volcanic eruption that put a bunch of moisture in the stratosphere that's reflecting the solar radiation and cooling the atmosphere, both in the stratosphere and at the surface. When that happens, typically the preceding winter in northern hemisphere is usually favored towards a weak polar vortex or an active polar vortex. So let's cross our fingers and hope that happens. The Climate Prediction Center's kind of jumped on board with equal chances the first 3 months of next year, and that's the better sign than we've seen in a long time.
Yeah, a hint of optimism for sure. Maybe not for this southern gal that's getting used to the climate here in Kansas, but optimistic for sure for the rest of the state.
Yeah, let's hope that trend continues. We still have a lot of time between now and then, but we got to tough it out, and hopefully next year we're beaten to a different drumbeat.
Absolutely. Well, Chip, thank you so much for your time today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was Chip Redmond. He is our K-State meteorologist, providing this week's agricultural weather update. That concludes today's programming. We'll be back with more next week on Agriculture Today.